Great. Thank you. Adrian Motika grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana, and is a graduate of the MFA program at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. He is the author of The Devil's Garden from Alice James Books, which won the New York New England Award, and Mixology from Penguin in 2009, a winner of the 2008 National Poetry Series. His third collection of poems, The Big Smoke, came out in 2013 from Penguin, and it focuses on Jack Johnson, the first Black heavyweight champion of the world. It was awarded the 2014 Ainsfield Wolf Book Award and a finalist for the 2013 National Book Award, 2014 Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and 2014 Pulitzer Prize. His fourth collection, Map to the Stars, was published by Penguin in 2017. Somebody Else Sold the World was published by Penguin in 2021. Among his other honors are the Eugene and Marilyn Glick Indiana Authors Award and fellowships from the Academy of American Poets, Guggenheim Foundation, Lannan Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Rockefeller Foundation, a Simon Fellowship from the United States Artists. He is the Ruth Lilly Professor of Poetry at Indiana University and served as Poet Laureate of the State of Indiana in 2018 to 2019. The poems in his newest and fifth collection, Somebody Else Stole the World, meditate on the ways we exist in an uncontrollable world, in love and its aftermaths, in families that divide themselves, in protest-filled streets, in isolation, as routines become obsolete because of lockdown orders and curfews. Somebody Else uses the past and future touchstones like pop songs, love notes, and imaginary gossip to illuminate those moments of splendor that persist even in exhaustion. Patricia Smith, who's reading here on April 27th, says of his book, his muscular and mellifluous soundtrack is a savvy directive that reminds us that even chaos has a rhythm you can dance to. With a masterful ear for lyric and an eye for the detail that jolts and surprises, the poet adroitly reintroduces us to a world where a simple breath was never too much. He even manages to dismantle that wee icon of violence, the bullet, until it is barred of its sin, its ability to end every story it enters. In Somebody Else Sold the World, we revisit the life we were living before the life we're scarcely living now. Please help me welcome Adrian Motika.
Thanks for that, Jennifer. I appreciate you. Peace, Hudson Valley. It's so good to be here. I cannot tell you what a joy it is for me to get to read with Sean and Roger, two of my dear friends and poets who I've been writing alongside for years. You know, Sean and I went to undergraduate together at Indiana, and Roger and I were like tied up at Cave Canem in 2003, trying to figure out how to survive the Pennsylvania summer. You know, it is such a joy. So I'm going to read first because my book's old news. It came out last year, and we're going to spend this time celebrating Today in the Taxi and Best Barbarian. Look, if you don't have these books already, please pick them up. Both of them are stunners, as you're gonna get to hear. I'm just going to read for like 12 minutes and get out of the way so we can have the actual stars of the show get up. Thanks, Sean, and thanks, Roger, for letting me read with you. So this book, Somebody Else Sold the World, I wrote almost all of it during 2020, between March and October. And I imagined that by the time I was reading from it in the world, that we would be past all of this. And Jennifer and I were talking earlier that she in fact was dealing with COVID recently. So clearly we're not past all of it. It was supposed to be a book of love poems, but you know, lockdown has a funny way of messing with love. So this first poem is called Somebody Else Sold the World. It was inspired by David Bowie's song, The Man Who Sold the World. Somebody else sold the world, and before I knew it, the violet sky flagged with the sun's violent demands. For magnolias in bloom, natural light, any place magnanimous without locks or doors, different kinds of masks for being and breathing. The antagonists with their vanity tans and usual mischiefs whistled jingles about liberties and war as we buttoned up in our confinement and we dreamed about hugging. We talked about was and when we missed our friends and dentist appointments. Molars dropped out without breathable air. Hair forgot its natural colors without testimonies at intersections and barbecues. Words lost their family recipes. Friends lost their words, then lost their parents. A mass few found love somehow in the gerrymandered grocery lines and farmers' fields upturned with unsellable vegetables. So the antagonists cornered the curfews, manufacturing arguments with guns at the ready like henchmen. The air around us was so ripe, it might have broken in half if we could touch it. So these antagonists pop up in the book. I borrowed that word from Ben Okri, the brilliant Nigerian novelist. And, and sometimes it's like Trump and his cabal. Sometimes it's my neighbors with their Confederate flags. Sometimes it's me not doing as much as I could do, but it kind of changes from poem to poem because we're all complicit. I said this was a book of love poems originally. It was also a breakup book because I got divorced a while back and I wanted to try to write through some of that. So this is one of those poems. It's called It Was Over Way Back Then. Because of want and tumble, because of word crumbles in the kitchen's halogen, separate bedrooms for years and here I am again, up top in the kitchen light, out front with the burnished stove and the microwave's immaculate readouts. Up here, my cross-cut hands greet the butter knife before the big spread. What I want now is a better ideogram for instead after the skull and crossbones on the pill bottles. What I want is a bucket for my panics and justifications, my coddled addendums down tagged on the sales table each and every spring. Here we go with that old seasonal bullshit again. Earphones on so your eardrums don't get punched out near the exit. Tom Ford's on too, just for the flex of it. Is it too much to ask for quiet after my losses in this insistent chorus of renew? Is it too much to be momentary in the morning grass, my suede kicks beaten up by the dew? I want to read another one of these Somebody Else Sold the World poems. There are 8 of them in the book. I'm obviously not going to read all 8. This one is, got an epigraph from Ben Okri. Hunger is the antagonist. Outside, the antagonists are wet with flag colors and sycophancy, and I'm alone in the front room again, like it's 1982 again, when the power got cut off and the neighbors brawled like sullen countries over the demarcation of kitchen table and china hutch. Another revolution breaking in half, another slim ringed alliance snapped under the weight of lost referendums. Where did their long stem love go? Even now, I'm sitting in the window seat in the year of cottonmouth and disaffection as white people goose-step masklessly and the antagonists imagine new ways to dismantle poor people. Sitting, running, dreaming, coughing, seeming, cuffs for all of them. Bullets too, glinting in perpetual velocity. To be poor is to always be blamed for your already busted happenstance. There's no change in that American tradition now, not even during a pandemic. Meanwhile, the antagonists boat out to their islands of isolation and repose. Anything they need is essential, while the rest of us, we stay in place like furniture. So I was thinking about I live in Indianapolis and I live in the city, but like 5 doors down from my house, there's this huge Confederate flag waving in the breeze. And it's not like a regular flag. It's like one of those flags that you would see at a car dealership or something. It's huge and it just is constantly waving even if there's no wind. And I would walk by it every day on my walks outside trying to get a little exercise during lockdown. And it was so disconcerting. It's still there. Imagine that right in the middle of downtown Indianapolis. This is a poem called Highest, and I think that the title is self-explanatory, but it came from a Travis Scott song, and it's got an epigraph from Travis Scott. I'm the highest in the room. I rise up, therefore I must be like Descartes if he didn't finish all the reading. I raise up like the highest Black hand in history class. I am risen like the blood pressure of anybody Black mimeographed in this chronic textbook of a monochromatic year. That's infant mortality rate high. That's high top fade high. Almost everything up here hangs threadbare squarely in the red line of summary excuses. Everything else up here, from the cop apologies to the solidarity statements, a double tap of distraction for somebody else's high sign. That's unemployment high. That's Machu Picchu high. What a relief, hardly anybody stuck around to see me on the low side of the mountain. What a reprieve, because I kept rising stealthily, past my historical anxiety, way past my inherited hearsay, until I am so high on the shelf, I eye-level alchemy. Even up here, I'm adept at shrinking myself for safety. Even up here, my shoulders hunch like a small analogy. I'm just going to read a few more. I want to read this poem. Right before COVID happened, I got the opportunity to read at the Amherst Poetry Festival, which is, centered in Emily Dickinson's house, and you read in the garden at her house. And one of the perks is that they let me spend an hour in Emily Dickinson's bedroom, which is kind of weird when I say it out loud, but it was really cool to me at the time. And I wrote a poem while I was in the bedroom and read it that night. And that poem became the poem I'm going to read now. I'm such a fan of her work. It's like the whole thing. So this poem is called It's All I Have / Daydreaming. And It's All I Have is a line from one of Emily Dickinson's poems, number 26. And Daydreaming is the title of a Radiohead song. I mentioned my dad, who passed away in September 2019, and also John Tribble, who was one of my mentors, and he passed away in December 2019, or October, excuse me. So it was a lot of loss that fall. It's all I have, daydreaming. I once got so high I couldn't remember if I loved me as much as I loved you. My mezzanine thin dream, my slip-streamed wish list. My knees wobble like the octaves above the sun clocks when you look at me. And the bees, phosphine swirling at 5 o'clock every day. I once got so hyped the buzzing sounds cleared out my ears while previous Christmases piled into questions. They reopened infatuations as almost reality. They broke my reservoir of debt eventually. In the damage, even imaginary oceans need imagined plankton, and so I ended up in the boathouse of quotations. Sometimes bees seem sentimental as they fan the air with things I don't feel like talking about. My old life, Pops, John. What else could I do after letting go other than hum at the water? All this loss mystifying as hydrology. None of it relieves my dreams of the three of us in Seattle by the glittering lake. It's backdropped by mountains as the water recedes. The turtles here submerge when geometrically convenient. Fish too, thinning in temporary current. All of us backstroking, so there's only sky to see clearly in the soak. Yeah. All right. Just going to read a couple more. Thanks again for listening. And, I can't wait to hear Sean and Roger read. Okay, so the last two poems I'm going to read. I want to read this poem called Later Isn't a Time. Back during the protests, if y'all remember this, about George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, there was a young Black man who was murdered by police officers in Indianapolis. His name was Adrian Reed, and he was shot 13 times in the back while he was running from the police. And all he had was a t-shirt in one hand and a cell phone in the other. And that cell phone was recording. So when he died, it recorded the cops talking about him. Later isn't a time. There's still no vaccine, but we can't wait until later. Around the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, homegrown antagonists watch from their covered balconies. They check pocket watches still ticking from the old century's wind up before sliding glass doors closed on the litany of naming that starts each and every march we make. The cops hang back, fidgeting in their gun belts and eyeing the blonde reporters. Naming murdered Black people won't stop rain any more than it stops bullets, and not even shelter-in-place directives can relax cop triggers. Their fingers remain as fat as grease, their familiar reactions sweaty as spring showers. We can't wait. A few miles from here, Adrian Reed ran away from the police with a t-shirt in one hand and 2 cell phones in the other. The cop fired his gun 13 times. Then Drejan was dying as his phone pointed upward to the sounds, yowling sirens, the cop's chin-first chatter, his last blue canopy of May. So as this man was dying, the cops were talking about him and they didn't know his phone was on. And so one of the detectives was like, looks like it's going to be a closed casket for you, homie, and things like that. And it's all recorded on this cell phone. And as you can imagine, the way it always works, nothing happened to any of them. The only person who suffered, the only people who suffered were Jason Reed and his family. All right. I just want to read one more. This is kind of the last poem in the book, the last Somebody Else Sold the World poem in the book. And I really felt like it was important for me to just sort of directly address Donald Trump and his foolishness. Also, there's a true story in it. For those of you who remember the movie Poltergeist, that movie absolutely terrified me when I was a kid. And I saw it, and it's in the poem, but I saw it on a Tuesday. And I was so scared of the movie, I became scared of Tuesdays because every Tuesday would remind me of this tree breaking through the window and pulling a child out of it, or a kid being trapped inside of a TV set. That stuff was just too much for me to handle. Somebody Else Sold the World. When I was a kid, I watched Poltergeist on a Tuesday and it scared me so much I was afraid of the weekday itself. And each Tuesday, the long-fingered trees outside of my head are missing some bark. Antagonists all over, mostly maskless as underprepared burglars. They cough without covering their tracks. They leave their shoddy fingerprints everywhere. On their self-congratulatory neighborhood walks, they acquit their own nondescript hearts until they burst and resurrect inside the TV's particled white. All voice and hardly any body. It will be weeks before anybody cares enough to change their channel. In my imagination, spring forward, the last antagonist on his fold-out phone feels just like a black man for a minute. Everyone crosses the street as soon as he gets near. His pockets are turned out to their white parts, and still everyone acts like he sold the world. Thanks, everybody.
I'm on mute. Thank you so much, Adrian. That was wonderful. Thank you for that reading. And also thank you for reading the poem you wrote in Emily Dickinson's room. That was really special. Now I'm excited to introduce Sean Singer to all of you. Sean Singer was born in Mexico in 1974. He has an MFA from Washington University in St. Louis and a PhD in American Studies from Rutgers University, Newark. He is the author of 3 books of poetry, Discography, which won the Yale Younger Poets Prize, and the Norma Farber First Book Award from the Poetry Society of America, Honey and Smoke, which was published in 2015, and Today in the Taxi, Tupelo Press, which just came out on April 1st. In 2004, he was awarded a fellowship from the NEA. Lori Scheck says about Today in the Taxi, Sean Singer's radiant and challenging body of work involves, much like Whitman's, nothing less than the ongoing interrogation of what a poem is. The taxi is at once a real taxi and the microcosm of the world. It is intricate, plain, suggestive, deeply respectful of the reader, and utterly absorbing. Like Honey and Smoke before it, which was one of the best poetry books of the last decade, this is work of the highest order. I've been waiting for this stunning book, Today in the Taxi, by Sean Singer, since I read the first poems he published from the manuscript in journals. This book documents the emotional toll the last several years have taken on all of us, on New York City, on America, all of us struggling to maintain our humanity in an increasingly dystopian world. He is truly a prophet for our age. Please help me welcome Sean Singer.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming and for your attention. So this is a book of prose poems about my experiences driving a taxi in New York. from 2014 until COVID started in March of 20. 1/10. Today in the taxi, I brought a man from Midtown to someplace in Astoria near the airport. He asked me to take him round trip. We got to the address and he waited outside the place and someone came out and handed him a brown paper bag. The man gave the person some cash. Then we left. He asked me to drive him to the E train instead. I don't believe in saints or omens, early winds, or the pink luck of a sunset. I don't see the Lord with her incisions and furry ornaments. The vehicle is not just a way to get to the crime, but to somehow bless whatever the journey needs. I use my braking and steering inputs to turn inward or even go down the uncertain road. Anti-venom. Today in the taxi, I got a fare from Parkchester to the Bronx Zoo. She finally came out of the building, put her baby in the car seat and said, I forgot something upstairs. Then she left the baby in the car, went back inside for about 7 or 8 minutes. I couldn't believe it. I'm a safe person to leave a baby with, but she didn't know that. I was nervous. Some people live without contradiction. I remained calm, though the situation was beyond the job description. Don Bias had a serpent's tooth affixed to the octave key of his tenor saxophone. Perhaps it helped him push into the wilderness or to ward off evil. One sunny July, Kafka says he wept over the report of the trial of Marie Abraham, who because of poverty and hunger, strangled her 9-month-old with a man's tie she used as a garter. Burnt plastic. Today in the taxi, I picked up a Wall Street type on Park Avenue near 48th Street. He was going to Montclair, New Jersey. His house was on fire and he spent the trip on the phone barking orders at his wife, his roofer, his contractor, his insurance company, and at me. He kept saying, go this way, or which way are you going? He said to someone, there are firearms and ammunition in the house. Periodically, he held back tears. It was a long 25 miles for me, and I suppose longer for him. We got there, and the house was burning. The Talmud says, nature rules over all things except the terror it inspires. Drive. Today in the taxi, I drove the movie star Carey Mulligan from the Upper West Side to Park Slope. I recognized her blonde face and perfect porcelain hand from the movie Drive. One of the many similarities between me and Ryan Gosling is that we both drive Carey Mulligan around the city. My whole body was running down the stresses. I hate gratuitous celebrity sightings. The sun was a peach more pushed aside than struck down. I felt completely like a driver or maybe a writer. Kafka wrote to Felice Bauer and said he drew up a list of things he sacrificed for writing. Just as I am thin, he said, and I'm the thinnest person I know, there is nothing to me which in relation to writing, one could call superfluous in the sense of overflowing. Days of winter. Today in the taxi, I brought a Chinese couple, parents of a student at Columbia from Amsterdam Avenue to JFK. The girl was crying, the mother was crying. The parents sat in silence for most of the trip. They didn't speak English and I didn't speak Chinese. I did offer them a little package of tissues. On the other hand, the sun came out and it warmed to 24 degrees. A driver should find a fixed object on a road, such as a sign or a tree, and when the car passes it, count 3 seconds before his own car passes it. Then add a second for each hazard, rain or darkness. The road is not unlike a little press between vessel that the car pushes along its black bloodstream. A psalm instructs that it will be as it is said. limbo. Today in the taxi driving a commercial real estate type from 43rd and Madison to 57th and Park, I said, would you prefer to go up Madison or Park? He said, it doesn't matter. Either way, we're fucked. And it was true when a black peer of birds burst from the building like fulfillment. I too seek to weave a memory from foam, a black bottle opener in the blackest bottle in the flow of liquids. You cannot know it, you can see it. General Beadle Smith reported that in April 1945, when they liberated Buchenwald, he witnessed General Eisenhower go to the opposite side of the road and vomit. From a distance, I saw Patton bend over, holding his head with one hand and his abdomen with the other. I too became sick. When the oncoming headlights are too bright, it is said you should look to the side of the lines on the road. You would stop yourself from being blinded and stop yourself to imagine the road ahead unstrung and the rubber against it. E minor sonata. Today in the taxi driving north on 34th Street in Astoria, a bus went through a red light and nearly killed me and my passenger. Hit with a heavy object, some carry-on with wet fur is misshapen, red, part raccoon and washed with road light. If ever there is wanting, you have found it. If something was lost, let it be discovered. Dusk's varnish, please swallow the continent whole. Earlier, my passengers were making out like they were the last people on earth. Simone Weil said, attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. Uncomfortable. Today in the taxi, bringing a guy from the Upper East Side to Penn Station, we were on Park Avenue when he rolled down the window and spit, just as a food delivery guy on a bicycle was riding by. The bike messenger looked incredulous. The passenger said, my bad, an expression I loathe. The bike messenger looked like, is this actually happening to me? The guy said, none of it got on you. The bike messenger looked like, what the fuck? The guy said, my bad, I didn't see you. Once an elderly woman remembered Kafka, who had rented a room from her parents in February 1924. The woman, Christine Geyer, said that Kafka, already sick with tuberculosis, was spitting phlegm off the balcony. Didn't he see the children playing below him in the arbor? Tensions. Today in the taxi, when a wild HVAC truck cut me off, I thought of Mingus and how he managed his rising anger. Everyone knows he put a shotgun hole in his ceiling when he was being evicted, and he grabbed a fire axe to kill Juan Teasel, who chased him down with a sharpened Cuban frog sticker. But what about in his private moments when he was asleep or in the shower? What remains is the timber of his base melting in the black firmament of a fluid tunnel and the black rose looking down on the mass of the earth. Layers. Today in the taxi, I picked up a millennial couple in Williamsburg. At some point, the woman moved her legs so they stretched across to the front passenger seat and rested them on the door handle. I wanted her to keep her feet on the floor, and not just because I feared germs. I almost used the word distracted. I could see the white caps of her muscles and imagine the blood inside them. It was a warm day and the air was sticky. I thought of the Lord having to clean up a kitchen after a TV cooking competition. She uses sponges and cleansers to get it sparkling, almost like a reminder of herself. She thinks desire means to have surfaces so clean, you could lick them no cleaner. Pink gloves. Tonight in the taxi, I drove 4 women from a bachelorette party complete with their tiaras and feathers, to another bar. Already happy, they pushed the bride-to-be forward, and she asked me how I thought she looked. I was too taken aback to answer much of anything. She was liquid, prehistoric, and my little body burned. I thought of the Lord throwing handfuls of sequins at the party, as if to say, there is no other life but this one. Purple Death. Tonight in the taxi, I knew the silence in the car with its gray and stain-proof velour that absorbed the silence on the other side of the windshield. The city vibrated and pushed the air up or down as wind among the petals. I thought of insects who might seek yellow pollen to stave off their own destruction. Kafka saw butterflies as great opened out books of magic. It's possible, but not now, that the Lord will open the door and suck the noise out of the car with her tongue. It's possible for her, but she won't do it now. She will be happy if one day there were no sounds attached to words and no ears to hear them. Verse. Today in the taxi, I picked up a woman with a little girl, maybe 5 or 6, on West 91st Street going to West 68th Street. When they got in, I said, she should wear a seatbelt, please. And she said, seatbelts aren't safe for kids her age. I'm a safe driver, but in a crash, whatever isn't strapped down will continue flying forward at whatever speed the car was traveling. I imagined fears of the apocalypse, yellow ants and bacteria coming from the ice caps. All will suffer. Who knows what danger we may have encountered had they worn seatbelts. Once it was claimed that the prophets can command things not in accord with the law. An old rabbi called it a commandment which is fulfilled by means of a transgression. They opened the door and went on their way. Which seed? Today in the taxi, my passenger was crying into her phone. She just had a miscarriage. Who was she talking to? Her mother, perhaps. She hoped there was an invisible hand that had some purpose in her tragedy. I pictured the Lord and her shelf of jars and vapors, her amino acids and carbons fit together with one black wheel and one white wheel. Every Sabbath, the rabbi would remove the slip of paper with her name on it from the golem's mouth, and it would become lifeless, nothing but a thimbleful of little clay cells. Look to the side. Tonight in the taxi, I picked up 2 women at Bellevue just after their friend died in an accident. He was skateboarding and hitched a ride on the passenger side of a garbage truck and lost his balance when the truck changed lanes. He was crushed by the rear tires. There were no heroes and no monsters, and there was silence. They loved him and they wanted something else, and they wanted cigarettes. I imagined some vibrations, the outlines of bones, dark things, the way the song moves. The last kind words I could think of were take care, but they were inadequate, and the shadows kicked over the wind's cathedral. Take hold of it. Tomorrow in the taxi, it will be another day. I'll read the book twice and then lend it out for someone else to read quickly. Then I'll read it again. When a prophet asked the Lord about what the book meant, she said, turn it and turn it again, for everything is in it. I pictured the black fire of her ink and the white fire of her parchment, everything far-reaching. Among the blur of noise and chaos from the demonic coming from the city's every window, she commented, be silent, for this is the way I have determined it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. That was really wonderful. Thank you for sharing those poems with us. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Roger Reeves. This is his new book, Best Barbarian. Please buy the books from all of the poets tonight if you can. Roger Reeves' poems have appeared in the American Poetry Review, the Best American Poetry 2014, Boston Review, The New Yorker, Plowshares Poetry, and Tin House, among other publications. He's an associate professor of English and creative writing at the University of Texas at Austin, where he earned his PhD. He was awarded a 2015 Writing Award, 2 Pushcart Prizes, a Hodder Fellowship from Princeton University, a 2013 National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship, and a 2008 Ruth Lilly Fellowship from the Poetry Foundation. His first book, King Me, from Copper Canyon Press, was published in 2013. It won the Larry Levis Reading Prize from Virginia Commonwealth University, the John C. Zacharis First Book Prize from Plowshares, and a Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Book Award. His second book of poems, Best Barbarian, was published by Norton just last week. From Grendel to Gilgamesh, Best Barbarian reviews and retells the most ancient of stories so that Roger Reeves can tell his own, says Jericho Brown. The capaciousness of these elegiac poems, their Whitmanesque need to hold and see it all, mirrors the speaker's need to be known fully as a Black father, a man in love, a surviving citizen, a son to his mother, and an investigator of his father's whereabouts, even after death. This book is an education on this history of the soul. Many of you heard Roger Reeves read for us on Zoom last February with Alicia Orsticker and Jeffrey Yang. We have been waiting for his new book since that night. Please help me welcome Roger Reeves.
Grendel. All lions must lean into something other than a roar. James Baldwin, for instance, singing Precious Lord. His voice is weary as water broken over his scalp in a storefront sanctified church's baptismal pool all those years ago when he wanted to be somebody's child and on fire in that being. Lord, I want to be somebody's child and chosen water spilling over their scalp, water taking the shape of their longing, a deer diving into evening traffic and the furrow drawn over the hood of the car power, and wanting to be something alive and open. Lord, I want to be alive and open, a glimpse of power, the shuffle of a mother's hand over a sleeping child's forehead as if clearing the city's rust from its face, which we mostly are, a halo of rust, a glimpse of power, James Baldwin leaning into the word light, his voice jostling that single grain in his throat as if he might drop it or already has. I am calling to that grain of light, to that gap between his teeth, where the many of us fatherless sleep and bear and be whatever darkness or leaping thing we can be. In James Baldwin's mouth, my difficult beauty, my weak and worn, my future as any number of angels, which is not unlike the beast Grendel, coming out of the wild heaven into the hills and halls of the mead house at the harpist's call, with absolute prophecy in his breast and a desire for mercy, for a friend, an end to drifting in loneliness. And in that coming down out of the hills, out of the trees for once, bringing humans the best vision of themselves, which of course must be slaughtered. I want to thank Hudson Valley and Jennifer for having me Adrian mentioned that I met him almost 20 years ago. He was my first sort of writing mentor at Cave Canem. He was a second year and I was a first year, or you may have been a third year. And he gave me some of the best advice that it still stays with me, which is sometimes people have to catch up to poems and catch up to where you are. And I didn't understand that. But he was just such a grounding force. And anytime I've needed something or had a question, I can always call on Adrian. And so this is just an amazing honor to actually read with Adrian. And Sean, beautiful work. Love those poems. And I think, and I love the Mingus references and what you're doing there. So I'm gonna try to like sort of in this reading kind of talk back to both you, Sean, and you, Adrian, see if we can't like sort of create sort of some synergy. So this next poem, and this book really is sort of thinking about several things, obviously what's happening in America, but also my father passed within the year of my daughter being born. And I wasn't raised with him, so I thought, oh, he's gonna get to be a grandfather. And then on my first Father's Day, I get a phone call where they said, your dad has 8 weeks to live. He has a very rare form of cancer. And it just floored me, obviously. And then for the year afterwards, every poem that I wrote somehow would veer towards my father and his death. So I'll read some of those poems as well. So this one's called Cocaine and Gold. I never wanted to be this far into the business of heaven, chasing my father, hunting his soul in the corn and confusion of this harvest. My father, who is hidden in the last sheaf of heaven, maybe heaven itself. My father, the corn wolf, who we must kill but is already dead. We will learn nothing here of the sacrifice or the cocaine of beauty. My hands chattering in eulogy, which is a search for order, which is nothing but the elimination of beauty by artifice. By artifice, we cauterize my father's drifting life, a minor cosmetic surgery, like liposuction. A funeral is an elimination of nature by artifice. By artifice, do you repeat yourself? Very well then, I repeat myself as heaven, as a golden harvest, as the broken ocean of corn. The search for beauty is the elimination of death, which requires dying, which is the business of farming, which no one cares to do anymore in America. And like dying, we'd rather rent it out. Freedom without freedom. To hold your dying father up to a razor beneath a golden light and cut him finally in and out of the world. American landscaping, Philadelphia to Mount Vernon. Who would have thought too much simultaneity? The swan planters hovering above the wind-beaten statue of the Virgin Mary that cast her gaze down on the repainted lawn jockey, his brown face spreading out over his white cap, a small rebellion, or merely an inarticulate hand overzealous in restoring race back to its place in God after winter makes heathen the heaven of horticulture. This is America calling, the golden pollen of spring blinging every available sedan, stone porch, puddle, and satin blouse hanging from a smiling white line into yellow salvation or forgetfulness. A black dog, antique in its hunger for my daughter's hand through a fence, my daughter in her machine in wonder willing to give. It is as if every moment is praying for whatever is above it or just outside its grasp. The dog for a hand. The lawn jockey holding his absent lantern out in front of him for the Virgin whose eyes no longer there, Januaried away by the blizzard's salt and wind, stutter with a brown streak I won't call bird shit, but rusted water dripping from the corrugated roof above. Even the flies in the earliest part of the sentence twitch above the sidewalk as if being accused of neglect, infanticide, murder, ending the empire in order to start another in their own image. But what is an empire fashioned in the image of flies? Mistake, it's not a lantern the jockey holds out in front of him, but a black hitching ring for masters to tether the tame because they lack mastering. Though not the jockey who stands on the wind and paving stones like Jocko Graves, the slave of General Washington, who froze to death enfolded in snow on the banks of the Delaware River, his lantern out in front of him, awaiting his master's return as he had been ordered. And Washington, so moved by Graves' frozen obedience, constructs a statue of dead Graves holding a lamp at his plantation home in Mount Vernon. Even in death, a slave must labor. Though I knew nothing of these clothes when on a Ferris wheel overlooking the muddy, syringed and bottle blank banks of Philadelphia, I kissed a girl through the tin smog and chemical plant perfume and carried that kiss through the year, touching newspaper, edges of blankets, the backs of hamburger buns to my lips, to remember the dimming summer. Sheepishly backing out of a door, it hurriedly burst through. Only in America will the sons and daughters of slaves kiss the sons and daughters of their masters and remember it as an opportunity to be human. Rat among the pines. Terror tonight is the moon slipping from a rat's gray grasp, finding its way back into the sky, which is America. A white moon leaning on the night's neck with its hands in its pocket. Moon hung calm above catastrophe. The police breaking the neck of a man who just brushed summer's first beat of rain from his eye lashes, who knocking a Newport against a wrist, watching smoke break its head against a brick wall, is preparing to die, unaware they are preparing to die. Heavy the moon, silly the tasking of a rat with delaying death. Terror tonight is the candor of the earth, where someone is preparing to die, and the earth receives that dying with its hands in its pockets. And the moon that once burnt the silk hump of a rat back in the sky. And my daughter hiding in the rose bushes, asking who the sirens have come to kill. And someone calling it beautiful, summer, moon, and someone dying beneath that beauty, which is America. Into the West. It would seem clear that no one can call upon thee without knowing thee. Though Augustine writes of God here, notorious for his absence, he could be speaking of desire, pleasure, the tick of snow against the dry leaves, which sends my daughter spinning on her heel. The sound of it, that, daddy, that. Sometimes the world, its loitering joy is just that, an absence that calls, demonstrates its over-there-ness, its being but without a proper name. So a silence sounded, as when I entered the clearing I once begged for. You, at an instant, absolute and looking back at me, as if witnessing a calendar or road you've already passed through. So my face now, and whatever wolf, vulture, or golden horn of pleasure, that, a ticking of snow against the wet road, nameless, thee, where you've been and left the body of that being. So I hurry and press into your leaving like a leaf scuttling after the dream of itself, into the sharp wet of snow against the skin, on into the West, where desire and sometimes pleasure is a type of faith, what you call me to in this spilling, this motion of night, your hair loose in the water of your back. Your spine has become the eye you wish for me to see through, but I must close my two good eyes, which is the beginning of any apocalypse or rapture, our daughter or the day, us touching the north and south of each other without compass or roads. This stumbling, a type of faith too, a seeing, but without the dependence on sight or some heavenly rule as signal of an end. It was like the deer outside, gathering at the window, licking the cold glass to smoke. So during the pandemic, I was at home like everybody else, trying to stay safe, trying to stay alive. And my daughter, who was 4 at the time, was home. And we had already had this practice before she went to daycare. I would read her a poem every day. And that's how we first started getting her into poetry and counting and teaching her about lines and quatrains and stanzas and all those things like that. And so during the pandemic, it kind of intensified because, I wanted to be like in poetry, but, also raising the kids. So what would happen is I would read her a poem and then we would have discussions about the poem. Often the discussions would be, what does it make you feel? Did you enjoy it? Do you see any color? Do you remember any details from it? And sometimes she would say, Daddy, I have a poem I want to write. Even though she was 4 and not yet writing, she would say, I have a poem I want to write. And she would write, and she would, just get caught up in the rhythm of language and make these just amazing sort of spells of poems. And so one of these poems really just knocked me out. And there was always a line from a poem. And so the last line in this poem actually is Naima, my daughter's, from her poem. And she always said, anytime I read this poem, I have to tell everybody that the last line is hers. And so she's 6. So, got to give Naima, got to attribute, where we should be attributing to. So this is called Journey to Ascension in Nanda, and it's referring to Alice Coltrane as well as Japanese art of kintsugi. Alice Coltrane, her heart fills in the cracks of me with gold. The Japanese call it kintsugi, where the vessel broken, only God will permit, only gold will permit its healing, its history. It's how the stars understand us. Lemon flowers on the skin of the earth, mosquito filled with the blood that sirens its fat, long life. Who isn't dying to leave this house, to go masked only in the shadow of one's animal breathing, lonesome, unprotected, knowing nothing lives as foreignness or death, that the black dog with the sword in his mouth, passing from house to house, will not bring its itch, its ticks and locks clogging our lungs, a permanent quarantine, nothing that a little gold melted to ichor and spilled into the veins won't seem. Everything is a blue divergence on a harp. The red bells and the purple crepe myrtle this morning, forgetting that soon they will be the corpses the spring tree kneels to observe. No, they remember, as everything dying remembers its mother's name. Say your mother's name, not for power, but for the glimpse of power, to be more than a hesitation, gold filling in the cracks, a window thrown open for no other reason than to continue a blue feeling. Nothing needed other than this devotion to darkness, a fire gotten brighter. My daughter holding my small name in her mouth, light broken, beloved, my daughter, a window thrown open, her voice gold filling in the cracked basketball court of me, announcing all nature will be dead for life soon. Yeah, that was Naima. All nature will be dead for life soon. I was like, yo. So for the last poem, I'll read, it's just called Children Listen. It turns out, however, I was deeply mistaken about the end of the world. The body in flames will not be the body in flames, but just a house fire ignored. The black sails of that solitary burning boat rubbing along the legs of lovers flung into a Roman sky by a carousel. The lovers too sick in their love to notice a man drenched in fire on a porch, or a child aflame mistaken for a dog, mistaken for a child, running to tell of a bomb that did not knock before it entered in Gaza, with its glad tidings of abundant joy. In Casimiras, a god is weeping in a window, one golden hand raised above his head as if he slipped on the slick rag of the future. Our human kindnesses, unremarkable as the flies rubbing their legs together while standing on a slice of cantaloupe. Children, you were never meant to be human. You must be the grass. You must grow wildly over the graves. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Roger. That was really beautiful. And please thank your daughter for that last line. Tell her that we all loved it. Okay, great. Now we're going to have a Q&A, and we're going to spotlight the three poets and bring them up here so we can ask the audience questions. I'll start with the question that we ask everyone who comes to the reading series, because we have so many students at the Hudson Valley Writers Center who are compiling their first collection of poems, either their first chapbook or their first full-length collection. And what advice, we'd like to know, would you give to the poets who are doing this? And keep in mind that they may be older students who have already had a different career and are coming back to poetry after that. And so they feel the pressure of time, maybe more than your 18-year-old students do.
So I'm just going to jump in right now and suggest that if they feel the need to have help with their manuscripts or the work that they're doing, they should contact Sean Singer, because Sean does this as an actual job, and he helped me with my last book. And I realized that I was reading from it and then kind of dipped off real quick and didn't say that Sean is one of 4 people who have read everything that I've written before it's become books. Like, he's from the beginning to the end. Sean has seen all of them, and one of the only other people was John Tribble, and he passed this, in 2019. So Sean is incredible like that. All of a sudden, I became an infomercial. Sean, maybe you want to give some actual advice instead of me just saying, "Hey, talk to this guy because he's good."
Thank you so much. It's kind of you to say. I think the main thing is to read and read as much as you can. Gustave Flaubert wrote Madame Bovary, said you need to read 1,500 books in order to write one book. So take that for whatever you think it's worth.
The advice I think I would give, for me, I always say, like, I'm a poet. What I mean is I love to write poems. I don't think about books. I'm really like, I always say I love to make a chair, right? Like, I'm not an interior designer. And I think that is sort of the difference between a book and a poem, is it's a very different architecture and a different sort of set of aesthetics to put together a manuscript versus writing a poem. And I think that is the thing that, for me, took a long time to figure out. And I got great advice from Jericho Brown, who used to, and this is way back in the day, he says, have a metaphor for how you would organize your book. And so one of my metaphors for this book was a jazz song. So it has like an A section, has an improv section through the longer poems, and then it comes back and sort of brings back the melody again. So I would say that helped me really organize the book, but I had to start putting it on the floor. I literally put it on the floor to sort of see it. So that would be just some quick advice I might say.
Oh, and one other thing I thought of, the it's very important to value failure. I think the quote unquote expert poet or writer has failed more times than the beginner has tried.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's not like you just wake up one day and you publish and win prizes and stuff. It's just a lot of work. It's not glamorous. It's very tedious. It's very painful, but that's what it is.
Those are great answers and very useful, I think, to our our students. A lot of students here who are here in the audience tonight have already studied with Sean, and we hope that Adrian and Roger will teach a one-day class for us as well at some point. Now that we have Zoom, we can do these kinds of things. The only silver lining of the pandemic that I have seen so far. Another question we have, could you just each of you talk a little bit about, some of you have mentioned already about how your books, these 3 books came about, but if you can elaborate a little bit on that and the process, the writing process for them, and maybe even a little bit the revision process.
I mean, I can start since I started the reading. You know, I mentioned while I was reading from those poems that I wrote most of them, you know, in the thick of the pandemic, trying to figure out how to keep myself together. And, you know, Roger, I love the idea of making poetry part of the process of, you know, just synthesizing the world day to day, you know what I mean? Like, it's such a beautiful thing. And so somebody else told the world was supposed to be out this year, but my editor read it and was like, no, we need to get it out earlier than that. And he never explained it, but just moved it up a whole year. So I went from thinking I had 10 months to revise these poems that I'd written in the previous 6 to having 2 months to revise them. And so Map to the Stars took me 6 years. The Big Smoke took me 8 years. And this book was like a year and a half. And I don't know if that's useful in process as much as it is to say that sometimes when you have pressure in your life, like being at home eating tater tots every day and, you know, trying to figure out how to work that off with walks around, you know, the neighborhood full of Confederate flags, maybe you need to write a lot. You know, maybe that's how it works.
For me, finding the right form is almost the whole situation. That the subject matter is almost, you know, secondary. So, you know, I had been driving for 2 or 3 years before I wrote anything. And then it took me a really long time to figure out what form it was going to be. But then I tend to think about poems for months or years, but then when I sit down to write them, it sort of happens all at once. And then of course I revise. Adrian and I both were lucky to study with Yusuf Kamanyaka, and he said revision literally means to re-see. So you have to sort of create artificial objectivity in order to do that, because we're too close to it. We don't know if it's genius or garbage, or it's too much. So I think anything you can do to create that artificial objectivity is what you should try to do. And that's the purpose of a writing group or class also, or workshop.
Really quickly, because Roger, you got to study with Yusuf too at CC, right? Yeah. I was going to just like co-sign really quickly what Sean said, that, you know, so Octavia Butler used to talk about a workshop being a rented audience. And so, you know, you have this opportunity because you've paid to be in this space to try out whatever you need to do. And so it becomes a way that you can kind of direct the work that you're trying to do. I'm sorry, Roger, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. I think one of the things, picking up on something and bringing a thread back from Sean's previous answer about failure, for me, I had written a whole other book as a second book. And I didn't know how to revise it. And I'm still trying to learn how to revise it. I think I'm learning how to revise it now. And then I had a child, and that really sort of, that second book had a type of ambition about it that felt to me a little bombast. And I think the concept, I think it was a good book, but I think it needed something else. And then, so it wasn't until actually like my father passed that I began writing certain poems. And really it's one of the longer poems in the book, Domestic Violence, coupled with the last poem I read called Children Listed, that I actually sort of knew about the book. And that wasn't until 2017, 2018. Right. So, and that was 5 years after, it was 6 years really after I turned in my first book in 2011. Right. And so for me, sort of thinking about a book, I 100% agree with everything Adrian and Sean said. But I think there is something about failing, right? And also writing multiple things. Like I used to say I had to write 10 poems before I had one good one that could potentially use. I think now it's become like 1 in 7. Right, so that's a lot of poems. So if you need 60 pages of poems, you only write, you know, or you think a book is 60 pages and you only can use 1 out of 10 poems, you have to write 600 poems. So you have to write, you know, 540 that will not be useful in that sense, right? So that was how I thought about this book, and just sort of like, I was really interested in using my daughter was kind of my guide in some ways in this book. Her language, her sense of being, because she was just so much herself. And I always think about something, like I wanted to write a book that mirrored these 2 quotes that Terrence Hayes likes to say, and he said to me quite a bit. He was like, I don't know if Nina Simone is a great singer, but she so much sounds like herself, it doesn't matter. And then he also quotes Thelonious Monk, who says, you know, the genius of the man was most himself. And so when my daughter, I saw this, she was just most herself. And I wanted to write a song that no one could be like, oh, maybe it didn't matter. It was such a unique song I was singing. It was such a song that we needed when I think about Nina Simone, that it was like, we're good with it, right? With however you want to sing, we're good with it. And so that's sort of the way that I think about making a book in the way I made this one.
You know, that's so beautiful, man. I'm thinking too about the fact that everybody on this, like all 3 of us, are pretty slow writers. Not slow in production, but slow in sharing it with other people, maybe. You know, and the amount of time it took for you to be able to find your way to the book that you needed to write, for you and for Sean, for this crew. And you know, and I think it's vital to recognize that sometimes poems announce themselves when they're ready to announce themselves, as opposed to when the deadline to submit to Adroitas or the deadline to submit to Indiana Review or whatever you might be thinking about sharing your work with. That's not the dictator of poems. Sometimes we just kind of line up. We're in the right place at the right time to be able to share our work with the journals and the communities that we want to. The work is separate from all of that, you know.
We have 2 other questions here. One from Patricia Smith to all of you. How did the forced solitude of the pandemic affect the work you've done for the past few years? She says, I'm thinking about all the time living alone with the huge specter of you and the looming doom the pandemic made all too evident.
I can jump in. It was for me, I enjoyed the reset. I don't think I would have a second book if it wasn't for the pandemic, to be honest. I think my life was really hectic in a way that I felt very much not like I was in control of it. And so that time of being, even though we were, you know, like I wasn't in New York, right, or in Boston, right, where like the pandemic came, it rushed in, and it sort of, I had a friend who actually came and lived with me, which was really, he came from Brooklyn because he was like the sirens, and you could see he was unraveling every week. So by the end of March, he was staying with me and my partner down in Austin. And so the specter of that, like that's what that the penultimate journey Ascension Dananda was about, really like sitting with, you know, this desire to want to go outside and just be in the world. But I have to say, I did a lot of writing, and it actually changed my whole writing process. I think because I normally had written on the computer, the only way that I could sort of manage writing was to give myself the room to fail at it. So that to me is handwriting. So I started handwriting much more during the pandemic. And actually, I wrote a lot of essays. And so I have an essay collection coming out in August of 2023, you know? So for me, it was like, it actually was, the sitting with the you was awesome. It also meant sitting with Naima in a lot of ways, my daughter, and just really building, like, I don't think I would have the bond we have now without it. Yeah, so maybe not the greatest of answers, but just,
Well, I was just thinking, and I haven't, I don't tweet enough to tweet this, but I was thinking that this was one of the readings that I've enjoyed the most via Zoom, like throughout the last few years. And the one outlier in this, Patricia, by the way, hi, I'm so glad you're here, it was your birthday, your 60th birthday readings, which to me was one of the most astounding events that I've been part of, that could not have existed without the pandemic. So as much, as frustrated as I've been with, as frustrated as I was rather with not being able to roam the world the way that I wanted to roam it, and to be be present the ways that I wanted to be. There were these small things that happened. I think, like Roger's talking about, this reset. I was so excited that first couple of weeks. I thought it was like Black Spring Break for a second, and then I realized it was going to go on for another month and another month and a year, right? But inside of that, a lot of work got done. I got my DJ set back out. I got to be part of the 60th birthday reading for Patricia Smith. All of these things that whenever we finally resolve this physically and intellectually, I'm going to have that with me too. And so it didn't feel that way in the middle of it, but it feels that way now when I'm looking backward and thinking about the gifts that difficult time gave me.
It's my turn. I think I was always, I was kind of social distancing before all of that, because I have a lot of social anxiety, and, I don't care to travel. I would just rather be at home. I mean, that's where all my stuff is. I think what occurred for me was, especially because I had been driving for Uber and Lyft for 6 years, is that now we're faced with higher gas prices, higher grocery prices, even though corporate profits are at a 7-year high, and yet they're raising their prices so that they can buy their stock back, and they're sort of passing the costs on to consumers, and raising prices and using inflation to cover the profit margins. And Uber, is not really a taxi service. It's a data collection service, and you are the product. They know your address, your credit card number, where you're going, who you're with, and so on and so forth. So, and they keep every trip, and I drove 8,000 plus trips in the cloud. So part of my thinking through the pandemic was to sort of restore the human element, or the human stories, instead of just making everybody into like a data point that could then be sold and profited on. That was the main effect on my thinking, and it's ongoing.
Thank you for those answers. We have a question from Michael, and he would like to know, what does it mean to be a poet in this world and this culture right now? Sean's already just started talking about that. And Michael says, you've already shown us through your readings tonight, and he thanks you for that. But can you say a little bit more about what you feel the poet's role in this time period is?
So I guess I can jump in to start out with, because I was poet laureate of my state, and it required a particular kind of presence. and a particular way of thinking about poems. I mean, for anybody who's been to Indiana, you know what this place is like. And and you also know that there are extraordinary people here writing poems in spaces you wouldn't expect that they would be writing them. So you have to kind of balance the long history of racism and misogyny and other things that my state has with the fact that there are people trying to write against that, wherever they might be, or write beyond that. And so, to be a poet is to let yourself have your feelings hurt, to let yourself be rejected, to let yourself be speaking loudly and have nobody listening, in the hopes that there is going to be that one person somewhere who's going to be paying attention. And also to be, in my idea of being a poet is to try to figure out ways to make space for those who want to share their work too. So being a poet is not just being an artist, but in my mind, not for everybody else, but in my mind, is also to be kind of a steward of community citizenship, where you're trying to make space for other people too, because that's how I was given poems. Other people made space for me to be able to write, so I want to be able to bequeath that to others. The trick is figuring out how to do that while you're also preferencing your own words in the world. As we were sitting here listening, as I was listening to Sean and Roger, I kept putting Post-it notes on the poems and sections that they were reading, because there's so many things I want to steal from the two of them. So I'm able to be in this space with them while also figuring out a way to fund my own research. You know what I mean? So to be a poet is to be the greatest grifter of all time.
I won't have much to add to that, other than to say, poetry is an ancient practice, right? And so we've been, in some ways, we need to really be looking at the whole history of poetry, right? Hence why, I'm really interested in thinking about the epic as a form of social critique, right? And sort of that space in the poem, the poem as a place of argument, the poem as a place of point of view. But I also say, lastly, and I think I was always impressed by this one philosopher who said, the artist's job is to make the invisible visible, right? And so I'm interested in taking something that's invisible and actually making it here. Sun Ra would say, bringing about myth, right? Bringing about impossibility, right? Sort of landing that here. I also think of one of my other sort of guiding, we might say, almost marching orders. It's from Adrian Rich's poem Dreamwood, where she says, and I think about this really, she says, poetry isn't revolution, but a way of knowing why it must come. And so that's what I'm trying to write. I might not be able, this might not be the revolution, but I'm going to try to announce why it must come, right? And so I'm really interested in doing that. And I think that's sort of some of what a poet does, among many, many other things.
I think it's important to know that the reactionary forces, Trump, Putin, whoever, the part of their program is to erase the distinction between truth and fantasy, so that nothing is, that you can't tell reality from fiction. And poets really are on the spear point of thinking clearly and sort of defending the language and saying, this is important, this is what this means, and that's the way it is. Which is another way of saying that the problem with autocracy is a failure of imagination, that we feel that we have to obey in advance, and that language has no meaning. When Putin says he wants to denazify Ukraine, even though I have a Jewish president, a Jewish prime minister, he's not doing it he knows what the facts are, just to erase our ability to defend against that. And so, I think it's important that poets are sort of responsible, not just to express themselves or to be decorative, but to really defend what truth and what reality are.
And on that note, please buy these books because they tell us the truth. Thank you so much
Thank you.
for your beautiful readings tonight, for the amazing conversation, for your advice and thoughts on poetry and being a poet. It was really nice to have the three of you together, especially since you have this connection. And thank you for letting us record the reading. We will